So delighted to introduce our panel of experts this morning, and I'll introduce them starting at the far end. Eleanor McIntyre is Canada's Chief Operating Officer for BlackRock. Of course, they're a global investment firm that manages nothing less than US $6 trillion. She's responsible for strategy, business analytics, project management for the Canadian region, and Eleanor has been with BlackRock since 2006. Our second guest is Sadaf Parvaiz, who is Director America's Inclusiveness Office at EY. She's responsible for the developing and the implementation of diversity and inclusiveness strategies and initiatives for the firm in Canada, the US, and South America. And then we have Vinita Jajware, who is president of Toronto Insurance Women's Association, a non-for-profit trade organization. Vinita acts as a resource for the entire insurance community, including brokers, underwriters, claims, and risk management professionals. And finally, just beside me is Rahima Mamdani, who's the VP People and Culture at United Way. So she's responsible for organizational culture, talent management, human resources, diversity and inclusion, and has had an impressive career at Bell Canada, Civil Systems, Rogers iMedia, and BuyBuddy. So really looking forward to hearing from these esteemed guests this morning. So starting off, and maybe we'll just actually ask this question to every member of the panel, is if they could just start off by naming maybe their top 2 best practices or policies in terms of driving change in the workplace. We'll start with Eleanor.
Thank you. So at BlackRock, we think of this both as from an internal perspective and also externally. As the largest asset manager in the world, we are investing in a lot of different companies, pretty well every company that's listed on a stock exchange anywhere. So we've used that influence as well to think about company governance, corporate governance, and how are companies looking at their diversity and what do they have in place. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But internally, I think my 2 favorite things that we're doing is we insist on diverse slates for every position that we're recruiting for. And as part of that, we've come up with 3 things that we've trained every hiring manager on and continue to hire. Lots of our hiring managers are only hiring 1 person every year or every other year, so we need to make sure that they are keeping current with the latest. So we try to make it catchy, and the first one is hiring the best. We've redefined what best means because we were hearing from hiring managers, oh, he was the best candidate, or this person was the best, without actually looking at it through a diversity lens. So what we do there is we insist that the hiring managers look at what are they trying to achieve as a business objective, what are they doing as a team, and then rank out what the competencies and the skills and the experience of that's required to meet that goal, and then rank each of their people on where they are with those competencies. Where are the gaps? And that's what they're looking to recruit for. Our second piece is no replicants. You can't hire someone from the same school or with the same degree that you have. You need to be looking for people who are different from the makeup of the team. And thirdly, we're all talent scouts. We expect our managers to have networks that are beyond the traditional networks. They need to take time to think about what networks are they part of, are they expanding their scope and looking to be part of networks that don't look exactly like them. So those are 3 practical things that hiring managers at BlackRock are all charged to do.
Excellent. Sadaf, what about at EY?
Yeah, so I would like to share mostly around our definitions. So I think that language is really important, and your people, for an organization like ours, 280,000 people in 150 countries, how do you have a common language around diversity and inclusion, and what does that mean? I like how Wendy earlier commented on cognitive differences. Often when we started our diversity journey, diversity equaled women. That was what people thought, and it really inherently is exclusionary to our men. And, you know, obviously in those early days, we did experience a lot of backlash, because if you're talking about diversity and not including everyone in the conversation, you're not going to get very far, especially in an organization where we all know that at the senior levels, it's still heavily male-dominated. So I think that was a really critical inflection point when we defined diversity and inclusion at EY. What does diversity mean? And it means, just like Eleanor was mentioning, different educational background, what schools you came from, cognitive differences. I'm really proud to say that we are going to be opening a Center for Neurodiversity at EY. We will be hiring people on the autism spectrum. So if you know anyone who fits that category, we would be happy to recruit. We've had really great progress on that in the United States. We have 3 neurodiversity centers in the United States, and they do some really great work for our firm, because obviously we have so many different types of work we do as professional services that is right in the sweet spot for people on the autism spectrum. So more to come on that. But I think that the definitions really matter, and making sure that people are clear about what that means, that it is about men, it is about LGBT, it is about people with disabilities, and it's not just about the identified groups. But more practically, I really like what language we've been using around PTR. So that's preference, tradition, or requirement. And it's such an easy thing for people to use in, you know, those decisions that are made in a meeting, or even at a bigger level, feedback, performance reviews, appointments to senior title leadership positions. So preference, tradition, requirement is something we just say, well, did you do PTR on that? Like, are you really putting this person in this role because you just prefer their work style, because they're like you, they get you, they know how to put the file together like you like it? Is it tradition? It's always been someone from Texas A&M or, you know, Ryerson University, or is it truly a bona fide requirement of this role? What will make this person successful in this role? And is it what we really thought it was 15, 20 years ago, or is the skill set different now and we've just never really thought about it that way? So PTR is just this quick way that you can bake it into the system and call people out when they're suggesting or putting some idea or person forward. So those are just the really highlights, I'd say.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it underlines how, you know, even still today, I'm still surprised how many people talk about a good fit, you know, because it's somebody that's similar to them and feels like a good fit, and how much that isn't questioned, and it's still used quite openly, which is so surprising. Okay, and Vinita, what are your top 2?
So speaking a little bit more broadly, as our association really does encompass multiple property and casualty and life and health insurers, we have a little bit of a different lens. And that through our membership, the best practices that we're aware of and where we see organizations having authentic success is when the whole conversation around diversity and inclusion is met with both executive sponsorship, but HR allowing organizations within their ERG groups to actually proceed authentically and be more of a guiding hand versus leading the ship when it comes to how these ERG groups are actually executed within the organization. I will say that the metrics that matter in the feedback when we do discuss this with our member companies is the reality that we might tend to execute, you know, D&I is great. We pursue these ERG groups. It's met with some level of executive sponsorship without engagement. Programs are executed, and then we go to measure. Well, if employee engagement amongst the equity-seeking groups that are truly meant to be benefited by these programs has not had the needle move, while we have opened the door to conversation, what tends to then be lacking, at least on the maturity within the P&C industry, is the ability to drive those factors forward. Fortunately, associations like ourselves have partnered with multiple organizations to make the diversity and inclusion mandate within the P&C industry be a broader industry challenge and not just limited to an organization by organization outlook. So through initiatives like the Lloyd's of London Dive In Festival, this is a global diversity and inclusion festival that through our organization, TIWA, and a group of like-minded P&C and life and health insurers, we've been able to celebrate having conferences very similar to this that allow direct focused resources within our insurance community to help from those organizations who might just be starting out. Maybe they've got an ERG group of 2 individuals, to those who have sophisticated diversity and inclusion programs within their companies that are now hitting the maturity stumbling blocks where they're measuring to understand what might work and what might not be working, but equally to dive forward to make sure that this isn't just a flash in the pan and that EDI has a seat at the table with all decisions being made at the organizational level.
Okay, excellent. And Rahima, what about at United Way?
So I thought maybe I'd focus a little bit on culture. My title is People and Culture, not Human Resources, and we've been very intentional about that because, you know, the concept of the business case, everybody recognizes that as a social justice organization, inclusion and equity are going to be critical for our success. So we've actually had a decade-long articulated diversity and inclusion strategy and program at United Way. And it's kind of split into 2 main areas, I would say. One is really the responsibility of my team in terms of the kinds of programs and entry points that we provide. So how do we actually create that ecosystem? We have been very intentional all the way through the whole employee life cycle. So my team is involved in how do we actually craft a job description. Is that really, you know, to the point that you made, is that really a requirement for the job, or is that just your preference? And so we will push back a little bit and we will work on job design, making sure every job is actually a meaningful job. Are you just taking out all of the stuff that you don't want to do and you're creating now a not so exciting position? So we work really from a systemic point of view. My team is involved in screening resumes because we're about 225 people, so we can do that. We're not thousands and thousands of people. And so for us, you know, having that foreign sounding name is actually an advantage to you because that's something that we look for. We're looking for a diverse slate of candidates, knowing that you can't tell from a name and all of that, but it is actually something that we make sure that we try to remove those barriers up front as much as possible. And all the way through our recognition program, our performance management program, our internal communications, which we're actually responsible for. We're infusing the organization with this culture of inclusion. It even comes down to our all-staff celebration. We have this party every year, and people come out and they play games. And so people don't recognize necessarily that we've, you know, in the background done all this design. So you're playing Family Feud, and it's like a fun game, and we're playing. But all those questions that we ask really get at inclusion and really get at human connection and our culture. We actually have a diversity and inclusion team, and so for 2 years we have volunteers from across the organization, all levels, all parts of the organization, who come together and talk about what's most important that's happening in our community and in our organization at this time. And they actually create programs. They decide on the kinds of learning and development initiatives that we're going to have. They put together panel discussions. We make sure there are lots of entry points for people to have dialogue around issues of diversity and inclusion that are important to them at this time. And so that team actually have an opportunity to lead the work and to create those entry points. We have people in our organization who are deeply, deeply committed to this work. It's part of their identity. And then we have people who think, yeah, that's a really interesting thing. We should do some of that. And how do you actually make sure that there's a way for everybody to be a part of it? So those are the 2 kind of main things we do.
Excellent. So a bit of a follow-up question coming from that and related actually back to Wendy's presentation earlier. She talked about the whole concept of bystandardism and, when, being the voice for diversity inclusion within your organization. I know that for myself and I'm sure for you, it sometimes becomes a bit tiring that you're often the one to raise at a meeting, well, have we thought of this, or have we considered this, or have we looked at this the right way? And so all of the policies and, all of the good intentions are great, but I wonder if you could talk, and maybe this is more out of personal interest myself even, do you have ways, calling out can often be something that makes people defensive or that can be difficult, and it's not always an easy process. And I wonder if you have best practices that you use personally as an advocate, as a champion within your organization, to raise these issues all the time, and to do it in a way that doesn't create more of the defensiveness that we're talking about. Anyone who might have an answer?
Yeah, so at EY, we joke about the fact that our culture is EY nice, right? And nice can get you into a lot of problems because we don't have typically a call-out culture. We're all about collaboration and working together, and so that can be sometimes countercultural in a lot of ways. And so we're lucky, fortunate that our global CEO, Carmine DeCivio, and our previous CEOs have all been so super committed to D&I, and it's part of their business strategy, to Wendy's point, that this is a business issue. And so he has pulled together a diversity council, global diversity council, and these are very senior leaders. And I think it's important who does the calling out, because for some people this can be career suicide too. So we've got to be cognizant that not everybody's in a position to call out. And so it is oftentimes people acknowledging privilege, acknowledging their role in this, and that they are expected to do this when they see it. And so we've got executive sponsors who are usually not of the underrepresented group sponsoring. So for our Black Professional Network, executive sponsors, not a Black person. So to be able to then voice when they see things that are not right, and because of their privilege, they can do that. And because of their role in the organization, they can do that. And that sets that example to what I would call the frozen middle. We have an issue with the frozen middle. So our organization, we have no issue at the top, right? We have 3 out of 7 executive committee members are women. Our U.S. chairman is a woman. So it's not an issue of the tone at the top. I find the frozen middle to be our biggest problem. These are just line partners with regular P&L, responsibilities who are just trying to get their file done, in a cost-efficient and revenue-making manner, and they're the ones that look up to these senior leaders. So if they're getting expected to do something, or if they see their senior leaders care about something, then to be honest, it may not be for altruistic reasons. It may be for their career that they start to mimic, and that's a good start. So I think for us, having that really senior leadership and executive sponsorship is important, and those senior leaders have come a really long way. So they didn't recognize their own privilege, and so there's a lot of reverse mentoring that happens. They go to situations where they're extremely uncomfortable. So our executive sponsor for our Black Professional Network goes to, it's called the National Association of Black Accountants in the US. There's literally thousands of Black accountants, and they are the one that stands out. They are the one who feel uncomfortable for the first time potentially in their life. So that just learning experience through that immersive, surroundings really opens their eyes to what it feels like to be LGBTQ plus, or an underrepresented person in a world and an organization that was basically, let's call it like it is, built by, the white patriarchy, so we've got to be able to call that out and acknowledge the privilege, and I think that that's really helped us move forward. But of course, there's going to be that frozen middle that we're still working on. But I think then when they see that at some point this is actually going to be a career roadblock for them if they don't, fall in line, then that's a pretty good indication that they either have a career here or they don't.
Excellent. What about you, Eleanor? Sorry.
We might have the opposite problem at BlackRock because our culture is, we're built a New York City investment firm that is now global with 14,000 employees. And it's never been a particularly nice culture, not that it's unnice, but it's a culture where people are very open and very quick to raise objections. And part of what we've had to do is train our people or reinforce with our people that there are appropriate ways to do this so that people who perhaps are introverted or someone who doesn't need to be the loudest voice in the room has an opportunity to put their point of view across as well.
And do you see senior leaders giving up their, passing the mic in a sense in terms of giving up their opportunity to have more inclusivity?
Our 2018 objective for inclusion was around belonging. And part of belonging we actually have in every meeting room in BlackRock is meeting room behaviors. And it starts with assume positive intent. Secondly, anyone who's on the line, because we're global and we do a lot of VCs, they go first. And there's a list of 10, which of course I can only remember those 2 at the minute, but they are in every room. And we do hold each other accountable for that because 90% of our day or 80% of our day is meeting based, and we really needed to make sure that every voice in the room had an opportunity to give their point of view.
Sounds pretty nice to me. Vinita.
I was just going to add and echo to your earlier point that really where you start to see the most impact when it comes to advancing the agenda of any equity-seeking group is when the person who's championed that message is not what you would expect to be the advocate or sponsor of. So for example, as a racialized minority first-generation Canadian who is president of a women's association, I am immensely benefited when I walk into any of our members' boardrooms and the person advocating for diversity when it comes to gender parity is perhaps a Caucasian male who feels empowered to sponsor this as part of, whether it's a part of their executive agenda or whether they just truly believe it's the right thing. All of this mandate is furthered by the person you would least expect it to be the one championing this cause. Similarly, our association in our near 60 years of existence has utilized our platform of women's issues to leverage other equity-seeking groups who tend to be left behind within the insurance community. So as an example, our organization spearheading an initiative around Pride this year and creating the first ever multidisciplinary insurance presence in this year's Pride Parade. By being the sponsor of this initiative and not the most expected source, we were able to provide solace and comfort to individuals who would have otherwise gone unnoticed within our insurance community because they don't necessarily want to align with their ERG group within their organization out of fear of reprisal. So things like this, where if we look at the intentionality behind our approach, and while we're all very fortunate, we're like-minded individuals in this room, we obviously care about issues surrounding diversity and inclusion, but let's help each other out when we're at the table so that we can all lift some of the burdens of other groups so that this message can actually be further proliferated in our organizations by it not being sourced by the most loudest, consistent voice.
I just wanted one quick thing to add to that is there is research out there that managers in the organizations that are of, underrepresented groups are actually, their career doesn't benefit from pushing D&I forward. So oftentimes we lean so heavily on, when we finally make a female Black partner, and we want to put her on every single panel, we want her to lead all these D&I initiatives, we're not doing her any favors by doing that because it can actually backlash on her in terms of her career. So we've got to be really intentional, to your point, on who we put up and how much we're leaning on those people that we think are, it's great to have them as role models, but not to have them lead so many things around D&I.
So for us, this concept of calling out, my personal hope is always to create kind of a self-correcting system, right? So that if somebody says something that they shouldn't have said, that it either gets no airtime and it falls flat and that idea is not picked up, or that people in the room feel like they have the skills and the empowerment to actually say something about it, and not in a way that is pointing fingers and that makes that person now feel like they can't come back from it. But there's a skill around that. So first of all, I would say at an executive level, if something happens and we see it, we have a conversation about who is it that's going to go and address it. It's not whether we're going to address it, but who is going to address it and how. Right? So that's modeling it, I would say, which is an important part of our culture. But then we over the years have had lots of requests for training on how to have difficult conversations, because people do feel vulnerable in those situations, and we do try to bring that back. And it is a challenge. It is hard to do it, but it is one of the parts of our diversity and inclusion work that we have really stuck to. We did a whole campaign on how to be an ally. What does it actually look like? And do you just swoop in because you feel like you want to protect that person so that they don't have to do it and you're going to take it on for them? And there are problems with that as well. So how do we have those kinds of conversations about, do you ask permission for that? Does it actually make sense for you to step in? How would you do it? Some people can use humor really disarmingly, and they're really good at it. I'm married to a British person who can do this so beautifully, right? But it comes with, that's his personality. I can't actually do that in the same way. But how do you actually take some of those lessons from people where they can share with each other, I did this and it really worked very well, or I tried this and, I wish I had done that instead, and making space for those kind of conversations. And that gives everybody permission that this is actually part of what we want you to be able to do.
Excellent. So one of the things that at least I don't hear a lot of talk about is the whole idea of measurement, and what gets measured gets done. And I think some of us within our organizations do have specific things that we measure. We have maybe a wish list of things that we should be measuring, and I wondered if somebody could talk a bit about performance and measurement and what you do or don't or should be measuring in terms of diversity and inclusion.
I'm happy to start with that.
Yes, excellent.
So we do a lot of measuring. We're an analytical company, and that is in our DNA. So certainly as far as measuring for talent and diversity objectives, each of the Global Executive Committee members of BlackRock has objectives around diversity and inclusion and talent objectives, and part of the bonus pool assignment to their business is based on the measurement, how they score on those objectives. And this is included right with revenue, with budgeting, with strategic initiatives. Talent and diversity is on equal footing with those objectives. We also do quarterly business reviews on each of our major businesses. We just had our quarterly business review for Canada last week, and part of that is how are we scoring on our diversity metrics, if you will, against hiring, retention, and development. So as the slate of candidates for promotion is looked at, we look at that across all the diversity dimensions. We are also scored on what types of employee networks are we fostering within our various offices. So it's written right in there with the performance objectives that are more traditional in our business.
So at EY, we have a diversity and inclusion culture change continuum. So we measure things at the both individual level and the organizational level. And so there are metrics, for example, at the individual level, we're looking at things like our GPS scores. That's our Global People Survey, and there's specific questions around D&I. I feel free to be myself at work. I use informal flexibility to manage my working day. And people will answer also, a new one is around belonging. So we have done a lot of work around belonging. We actually did a barometer on belonging. And what's interesting to me is oftentimes we make D&I so hard, like that it has to be this formal program that has huge budgets behind it and all these people working around it. And what was really interesting, and one of the key findings from the survey, was that 31% of people said that they feel like they belong when someone just asks them how they're doing, asks them about how they're doing personally. That was more important to them than public recognition, being included in an email with the senior leader, being asked to go to an after-work event with the senior leader. More than that was just ask, and it's shocking to me that we just don't do that anymore. So I think, to Rahima's point, like the piece around difficult conversations, it's not difficult to ask somebody how their day is going and how they're doing, but really asking, right? Like, what is it like to be you, outside of the firm? And so to me, at that individual level, that's something that we can really foster and think about. And organizationally, of course, we're an accounting firm, so we like measuring things too. But to me, those are all outcome measures, right? We're always looking at representation. We're always looking at women on key accounts. We're looking at, promotion slates and all of that. But usually, our team is looking at that after the decision. It's an outcome measure. So to me, it's about how do we know what's really happening with our people as they're going through, and making sure that the right people are sponsored, that we're having those check-ins so we know if someone's foot is 1 foot out the door before it happens. And so really being in touch with our people and having our people have just regular conversations is actually probably more preventative than us focusing on the outcomes. But of course, those outcomes are important because for our leaders, they want to know, how are we doing? Where are we going? Why isn't the needle moving faster? What can we do? And so similar to BlackRock, our partners are responsible for sponsoring people that are different from themselves, and they can define difference in a lot of different ways. But we're trying to get at making sure we're sponsoring people that aren't your usual people, go-to people, the people that you always hang out with and would normally sponsor anyway. So to me, those are some of the big metrics we use.
So two different schools of thought, and I guess I will start with, as an industry, the property and casualty side of insurance is benefited by the work of the Insurance Institute of Canada, who for the last 11 years, to your point of what's measured gets done, has really been our industry's leader in aggregating talent data through their licensing protocol to be able to provide key demographic information to all P&C employers. So on one hand, while our licensing body is taking a spearheaded approach to providing industry companies with that information, on the other side, data aggregation with P&C insurers is actually very much at a youthful start. Anecdotally, we had Wendy come speak at our diversity and inclusion conference, and one of the most shocking responses that she had to overlay to all of our participants is the fact that so many were so conservative in the P&C industry that they didn't know legally what they could measure. So when you look at the maturity cycle of capital markets and financial services and the professional services on the other end, we still have P&C insurers who are completely unclear on what can I legally ask and measure. And in that lens, it was very refreshing to hear Wendy bolt out, it's not illegal to ask. You can't just force people to acknowledge gender, disability, or anything like that, but you can present the question to at least be on the forefront of starting to gather that data. So as an industry, although we're on the very junior end of this data evolution process, we are definitely benefited by candid remarks by folks like Wendy, who are guiding us towards the finish line of getting useful information to leverage. I will say that on the employee engagement side, most P&C insurers have at minimum been aggregating that along with the success of their ERG groups to determine what programs continue and what stays within the executive sponsorship forefront, but very much tying that back to key business objectives and performance, where we're at the youthful end of that spectrum.
So for us, we do a number of things to measure the effectiveness of our programming. So those are kind of internal to us on the people and culture team. But the key thing that I think probably is of interest to you as an audience is that we do a survey. So when I mentioned that we started this work 10 years ago, so in 2009, we did an employee survey, so an anonymous survey that had two parts to it. The first was demographics, and we went a lot deeper on demographics than we would ask you kind of when you sign up, when you first arrive as an employee. So it gets into things like sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, et cetera. And then the second part of the survey were questions about feelings of inclusion. And so we were able to correlate the data. First of all, how do our staff feel about inclusion overall? But are there some populations of our team that are having a different experience than others? And that helps the diversity inclusion team to focus their efforts. So when we first did that survey, that kind of macro question of I feel I work in an inclusive environment was at 68%. And after a 3-year kind of focused effort, it went up to 90, and it has been holding at 90 ever since. And so that is a key measure that we look at. So the other thing that we do with that survey is that we actually publish it. Even though it's an internal survey about our own workplace, we actually make it available on our website, and we publicize the data. So we feel that that helps us with accountability around making sure that those numbers are holding, and if they're not holding, why is that the case? Interestingly, we're seeing different trends. Of course, we're doing this for a long time. And one of the key things that we are now looking at and kind of that we'll have to focus on is I'm finding that expectations are changing. Generational differences are really coming in. And so that's been a discussion that we've had. So if in my generation, I can remember where, the fact that there was anybody who wasn't white in a room was a really big deal, right? And I've explained to my kids, I was telling them the other day about how City TV, I remember they were the first people to have, anchors who weren't white, and they're like, what? And it's like, yeah, that was like when I was your age, that was the norm, and how things have changed. Whereas new people are coming into the workplace have expectations. They're not looking at this going, yeah, this is so much better than my previous experience. Their expectations are much higher from the start. And so we're starting to think about measures now to get at issues like that. What are your expectations? Are we meeting them, and are we moving past them?
Excellent. I have one question, and then we're going to go to the audience. So I think there's going to be, or there is a roaming mic if you have a question. And if I can just ask you to focus that question to one of our panelists. So just to Eleanor, Sadaf, Vinita, or to Rahima, just so that we're not going through every panelist for every question, but if you can focus the question to one person. So my question is, we're all learning, and we all kind of advance on this path with a bit of humility and needing to kind of be vulnerable at times and test things out. And I'm interested in the whole concept of failure or challenges. Have you tried something that just frankly didn't work or wasn't successful or backfired that you learned from? And I would really like to hear if you have an example. You seem to have an example, Vinita. So.
Do I ever? I would be remiss if I didn't emphasize this point that, generally speaking, with D&I work, we all pursue it with, hearts and minds in the places of the best of intentions. However, as the people who tend to sponsor this type of work and volunteer for it, all generally tend to be very like-minded. It kind of creates the perfect climate for blind spots. And blind spots that I could share from our member organizations, whether it's a talent recruitment campaign, where the poster child may not land with the local market based on certain political issues at hand. We've seen that from one of our life and health insurer members who, in the wake of some catastrophic U.S. shooting, were pursuing a local campaign that was not culturally sensitive to the market where they were hoping to execute. On the flip side, even as a association who's intending to do good equity, diversity, and inclusion work, when we executed on an industry first with this Pride Parade initiative around the LGBTQ2S+ community, we were so focused on the work that we were doing to benefit those members and aspects of our community that we neglected to consider that some of the participants who were supporting our organization as allies did not want to be acknowledged or featured in any photography out of fear of cultural reprisal, because supporting this community would mean very uncomfortable conversations with family and home, despite the fact that they personally and professionally believed in this. So having to pivot after the fact and aggregate a whole lot of feedback that's still very much supportive of the good work that we're doing, but although we were well-intended and well-meaning, considered all of our blind spots at the table, we were still surprised. And I think the key element of whether it's a failure or a success to continuously learn from is how you measure to continuously improve, and what moving the dial forward to your organization may mean versus another are two inherently different things at times. But know that in this space, there's definitely the possibility of landing on a blind spot that you didn't expect, and it is how you pivot and how you return from that truly does matter to keep the good work going forward.
Excellent. Do we have another example somebody's willing to share? Eleanor?
I would say our efforts at the beginning were all focused on recruitment, and that representation isn't enough. Anyone that you bring into your organization has to feel that they belong. So this is where we put in place what we call the platinum rule at BlackRock, which is treat people how they want to be treated, not how you expect them to be treated. And we talk about that in the a couple of actions we put with that is break the tendency to try to find common ground, which is quite often what we do as nice, polite people, and don't assume what motivates other people. And I think you touched on that a little bit. And one of our big pushes for 2020 is that we're expecting all people managers to have one-on-one meetings with each of their team members at least once every 2 weeks. And that just sounds like good management to most of us in the room, but to the point that was made earlier, if your manager never asks how you're doing or invites you out to the industry event in the evening because they have their go-to people, you won't feel like you're part of the team, and you will not stay with an organization where you don't feel that you belong. So very simple things, but that's my example. Thank you.
I would say that in our early days, we started out very siloed. And I think that really slowed us down, and we could have been further ahead much sooner if we had been a lot more, took a more intersectional lens to the things we were doing around D&I. Obviously, like most organizations, the focus started around gender. And when I say gender, let's just say it was white women, because most of our professional women's networks and most of the women, to Wendy's dismal data around the lack of women of color at organizations in leadership roles. So clearly, when the women leading the charge on professional women's networks and women's issues were all homogenous in certain ways. So and that was inherently exclusionary, like I said, to men. But then even our approach on underrepresented groups, whether they were visible minorities or others, everyone was doing work in their own ERG, and there was no kind of connection or cross pollination of ideas. And in some ways, a lot of our women, especially racialized women, would say, I don't want to go to the professional women's event. I don't really, just because I'm a woman, it doesn't mean I relate to any of the content that's being put out, the types of, frankly, even where the event was held, like things came down to even the venues of where things were being hosted. For example, wine and cheese, it's always a favorite, but I can speak personally as a Muslim woman, I don't drink. So to be honest, half the conversations around, this is a great wine, da, 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 and I'm like, don't know anything about wine. So you know, when we talk about, oh, the golf outings being exclusionary, let's think about some of the things we do even for our women. Are they inherently exclusionary to certain women, let's say? So we've made it a point now for our ERGs, if the topic, let's say it's personal branding, well, that's not a women-specific thing. You know, our visible, like, there's lots of other LGBTQ. Let's take a more intersectional lens around the topic and have your ERGs work together. And we've had so many more events that have been hosted by multiple ERGs. And that has really helped to not only learn from one another about what it's like to be, you know, a Somali Black Muslim woman in the workforce versus, so taking that lens is really important because we all learn much quicker and faster about what it's like to walk in each other's shoes. So I think that was probably a misstep in the early days when we were just looking at things so segregated.
So for us, one of the lessons that has loomed the largest for me is that when we also, you know, back at the time of the start of our diversity and inclusion work, you know, we put together a team and we were all gung-ho, and we, you know, you want to put together a project plan and you've got your goals and you've got your measures and all the things that you want to do, and everybody jump in and see what you're going to work on, and, you know, the way that we do projects, right? And it went so horribly badly at the very beginning. Like, you know, what we didn't do is recognize that we're asking people to work on stuff that touches on their identity. And you know, we hadn't actually really built the kind of culture where we have these kinds of conversations yet. And so at that point, I think, you know, you're touching on people's personal pain, and some people want to share that and others don't. And what we didn't do is stop first and really build trust among the people who are going to be having these conversations. And that has just been such a massive lesson to me. So each time we refresh our diversity and inclusion team, but also other, you know, other groups that are coming together to talk about these issues, is really creating the conditions where people feel that they can build that kind of trust and feel like, you know, they can share as much as they want to share, but they're also not feeling like if they don't, that's a problem. So how do you actually create those conditions for this work to actually, you know, have a good, firm platform? I think that has been a huge, huge lesson for me.
Excellent. Thank you, Rahima.